I've got to say, Lexi, I'm super excited because often we go out and we get all these like podcast experts who can speak in another podcasting language, but I get to speak to someone today and just really get like firsthand experience of what it was like starting your podcast and how you've been able to grow it. And I've got to say, not only are you a podcast host, but you also have a full-time career as a paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital. You've got your own private clinic and you're a mum of three. How does that work? I'm exhausted just thinking about it.
I often say I'm juggling glass balls in the air, and usually one of those glass balls drops and breaks and everything falls apart. But I think I'm a person who likes to do lots of different things. Someone once called me a neophiliac, which is a novelty seeker, and I'm always trying something new. And I think that's how I got into podcasting. But, I'm very lucky. I love all my different roles. I love being a pediatrician, but now I also absolutely love podcasting. So it's a pleasure to be here because I have been learning so much from your podcast, Danielle.
Excellent. That's what we like to hear. So Lexi, tell us, how did you actually begin in podcasting? Where did you get the idea from?
Yeah, look, I'm a clinical paediatrician who's been working in the public system for over 20 years. So there's a lot of patient contact and knowledge there, but I've also been very involved in education, and I have a non-clinical education role at the hospital. And so about 3 years ago, I went to an amazing conference called Creative Careers in Medicine. And it was a conference that was derived for people who are doctors, but who not necessarily wanted to, in inverted commas, just be a doctor or just have a clinical career. So I met the most incredible group of diverse people. But the talks I was really attracted to were the ones on media, on podcasting, on education. And I had a light bulb moment at that conference in Melbourne and thought, wow, podcasting's taking off. I'm not sure there's some really good quality information for parents and families about pediatrics in the podcast world. Maybe that would be something fun to try. So that's where I came up with the idea. But it's been a journey since then, as you well know.
Absolutely. There's a lot of bumps in the early days and a lot of trials and tribulations in terms of just getting the momentum of your podcast up and running. But I've got to say, now this Creative Careers in Medicine conference that you went to, that was 3 years ago. And you recently spoke at that conference this year about your own podcast.
Yeah, I think
Tell us
unfortunately,
about
it was virtual, but it was a really lovely sort of opportunity to go back, thank the people who'd set up Creative Careers in Medicine and tell different colleagues, so from medical student to interns to more senior doctors, how this journey evolved. So very similar to our conversation today, I really talked about where the idea came from and really walked people through the journey of where we're at now with our Kids Health Info podcast at the Royal Children's Hospital. So it was a lovely full circle event, but hopefully it's inspired some other people, particularly in medicine at that conference, to sort of find something new and exciting and follow it and follow their passion.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, Royal Children's Hospital is a massive organisation based in Melbourne, Australia. How did you get the sign-off? Did you have to get buy-in? Did you have to pitch it to lots of people? Was that easy or a difficult task?
Look, it's never easy to pitch an idea to someone, particularly in a public institution, which is, as you said, very large. I think because I'd been working here 20 odd years, I sort of know many, many people around and have a lot of quality relationships. But what I did is I went and did due diligence, as I always do. I'm a bit of a science nerd. And looked around to check whether there were many podcasts doing what we wanted to do. Because, in my opinion, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't want to do what someone else has done. It has to be worthwhile and new and useful to parents and families. So I sort of once I had the light bulb moment, I approached two of my friends and colleagues who were paediatricians at the hospital who were already involved in the comms space. So Margie Danchin already had a blog through the hospital called Dr. Margie, and Dr. Anthea Rhodes already was director of the Child Health Poll. So we had a few brainstorming sessions and thought, yeah, look, this is a great idea. Let's pitch it to the comms team, which is what we did. We went to head of comms and said, we're interested in creating this podcast. These are our thoughts. We think we've got good content. We think we could do it. What do you think? And at one point we had to make a decision. Do we go out on our own with this concept? Because there's a lot of advantages of doing things independently. Or do we go via the hospital? And we decided at that time to go via the hospital and do a pilot because there were already really good content out there. So the Royal Children's Hospital have great kids' health information fact sheets. They're used worldwide. They've got a great reputation. And we thought we'd like to sort of piggyback on the back of those visual fact sheets because some people learn visually by reading, others learn through audio. So that's why we decided to go with the hospital and really start by pitching it to one of the comms team. You asked, how complicated it was to get it over the line. The comms team were very supportive. They thought it was a great idea and concept. And, as everything, we started with a little pilot. We were lucky enough to we have an in-house creative studio that, they created into a podcast studio on recording days. And we have an amazing producer, Simon Pays, who does the production and audio for us. So that's a huge advantage. There's also an in-house comms team through the hospital who can promote and market our podcast for us. What we haven't got any sign off is on getting any funding for it. So, when you do an independent podcast, you can get sponsorship or advertising. And that's been one of the limitations and difficulties through a big public institution. You are limited by how you can promote your podcast. So it's been a fascinating journey, but we have had support along the way.
Absolutely. Well, the idea of having a studio that you can just go into, everything's ready to go, and then somebody takes care of the rest would absolutely be the envy of so many of our listeners.
Absolutely. And, when I try something new, I like to sort of upskill. You're probably the same, Danielle. I like to learn about the whole process. So when we decided to do try podcasting, one of my colleagues and I who were hosting decided to do a course, and I think that was incredibly beneficial. We did ours through University of Melbourne, and it was through Podcast Australia. But essentially, we learned from the get-go when you get an idea, how to pitch that idea, who your audience is, how to plan your episodes, how to plan your season, all the way through to recording and what is the best way to record, how to, use microphones, what sort of headphones to have, through to editing. So we had to do some sound editing ourselves, through to marketing and, creating titles. And I think learning that whole process from the start to the finish was incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. You've got empathy for the producer at the other end.
Totally. And I think what it did make me realize was, I really should be using my skill set to advantage. And my skill set is having good content and understanding pediatrics and common child health issues. My other skill set is, forming relationships, and having worked here for a long time, having a lot of really good relationships with experts from the hospital. But my skill set is not sound editing. So the amount of time it takes me to edit, makes it an impossible task. So I really think it's good to understand, but it's okay to actually outsource some of the areas.
Absolutely. Look, obviously I'm a big advocate of that, but I find it just slows down momentum if you're doing the tasks that don't bring you joy. Like often I see the difference between someone who is outsourcing those things that they're not good at, produce 20 to 50 episodes a year versus those that try and wear so many different hats and maybe get 5. Like you're just not going to get momentum and get listeners, and you're going to burn out if you're trying to take on too much.
Absolutely. And, as you well know, it's time consuming to create the content, reach out to guests, record the episode, edit it. So I think really picking and choosing what you find fun and enjoyable are the best parts.
Yeah, I agree completely there. Now, tell me, having multiple hosts, you mentioned that you've got two other pediatricians who also are on the show with you. Now, I know you're going to be super nice here, but is that a help or a hindrance? Like, what if you want to take the show in one direction and they've got another idea? How do you navigate that?
That's a really great question. And, when we were planning the pilot, we thought what would work well. Should we have one host and one expert guest, two hosts, three hosts? And there is no right answer. I think everything's different for different people and different purposes. For us, we wanted it to be conversational. And I think our point of difference was that the three of us are pediatricians, have been working in the space for a long time, but we also have 11 kids between us. So,
Wow.
there's a lot of children around. So I think as pediatricians and mothers, that was what we felt was our point of difference when interviewing our colleagues and experts. What we decided to do, which seems to have worked, is that one person's the host of the episode and one person's the co-host. So the host really prepares the content, reaches out to the guest, keeps, the momentum going during the recording. But the co host is really just listening in and jumping in with questions that might be relevant or clarification. So I think having different roles actually works. Interestingly, tomorrow we're recording an episode that had been planned in advance. One of my co hosts is working in Fiji and the other one's got a child home with COVID, and we haven't been able to work around it. So we've decided to go with one host, one expert. So we'll see how that goes.
But I really like that you've got some structure around this. And quite often you see when there's multiple hosts, they'll go through and go, oh, we're just going to wing it. And they end up talking over each other, both touching on the same points. So I really like that you do have that, okay, who's responsible to do the research and just allow for that other person to be fully immersed in just listening and jumping in with those value adds. I think it's really a smart decision.
Yeah, look,
Now,
hopefully it's helpful for our listeners. Sorry.
So, Lexi, tell me, in a relatively short period of time, you have cracked a milestone, which I've got to say would be the envy of every one of our listeners here. You've actually hit 100,000 listeners on your podcast in a really short time. So how did you do it? How did you get the word out there about the show?
Thank you. I think when you start in the podcast world, you actually have no idea what is a good listenership. And we wanted to really share quality information. The number didn't matter as much to us because if parents found it useful and they learned something from it, that was the most important. Having said that, when you put in so much effort to create content, you want people to hear it. I think one of the advantages of being linked to the hospital is that we do already have good content, those kids' health information fact sheets. So at the bottom of a fact sheet, we link our podcast. We match the relevant fact sheet and podcast. So if your child's got asthma, we put a link to the podcast episode and video, so different formats of education at the bottom. So that's a small number of our listeners find us through there. We also release one Insta post, one Facebook post, LinkedIn and Twitter from RCH comms team per episode. So we don't have the advantage of, releasing it multiple times. We're allowed one, and we're not able to have our own podcast website or our own podcast Insta profile. But having said that, because RCH already has a good following, we're getting listeners that way. And we do find that on the day of release of an episode, that's probably our biggest uptake. So we think that listeners are actually subscribing, and when new information comes in, they're listening. I've also, because of limitations of the hospital system, I've started to work on my own social media profile, really in order to try and increase the reach with my patients and parents and, parents at school drop off. As a pediatrician and a mother, I get asked probably on a daily basis about, sharing some information or, a question from friends. So often if we've got an episode on burns or needle phobia or vaping, I can actually direct people at the school gate to the episode rather than go through all the education once again.
That's gold. That's so good. I'm sure you'll have many mums running up to you, running up to your school pickup times. So, Lexi, were there times like where you were questioning whether the hard work was worth it? Like, obviously, 11 kids between, each of between the three hosts. Were there times when you said, okay, is this worth it?
Yeah, on a regular basis. I think, the three of us are incredibly busy. We all have portfolio careers in clinical work, in research, in podcasting, plus mothers, wives, friends, etc. And the comms team and our producer are incredibly busy at the Royal Children's Hospital. So I think one of the challenges has been trying to find time, trying to find time to record, trying to find time to edit. And there are many times we go, oh, this is in the too hard basket, doing it through the hospital or doing it without any funding. It would be really nice to be able to get sponsorship or advertising or some funding so we can be paid for our time. So we have, contemplated whether to keep going or to change the format. But at the moment, it's our passion project. We all love doing it. It's really gratifying when patients, families, mums at school gate, dads at school gate come up to you and say, oh, I listened to that episode and I learned so much about ADHD. I'm really worried about my child and now I know where to go. That can be really gratifying. So I think at the moment we're all incredibly passionate about it still, but it is a juggle.
Yeah. Well, that passion absolutely does shine through. And I've got to say, like, as a podcaster, we often get caught up in what I call vanity metrics, like how many subscribers or how many listeners. But the impact that your show is making is has far more reaching implications and benefit to the wider community. How do you measure the success of the show?
Yeah, so I think before, I went into podcasting, I'd never heard of metrics and hadn't been in the media space. So luckily, our producer is able to get it off the platform we use. And so now we have a meeting once a month and he just gives us an update on the different metrics. And what's really interesting is, when the listens happen, do people listen to the whole episode or do they sort of leave halfway through? Is there engagement on social media with the episode? But also, because most of our content's what's called evergreen, we try and create content that can be used forever about common child health concerns. And we have an occasional episode that's what we call newsjacking. So if there's a relevant pediatric or childhood issue, we try and release a bonus episode. So we've done a few with COVID and one with influenza. But because our content's evergreen, what's really interesting and rewarding is when people go back to listen to previous episodes. So it's not just when it comes out. A lot of our episodes, people go back and, we want people to listen to what's relevant for them. They don't have to listen to every single one. If you've got an infant who's not sleeping at night, you're probably not that interested in the vaping episode. But if you, have a teenager, you're probably over listening about fussy eating. So we're trying to really have that balance. We do check the metrics, but as you said, we don't necessarily go on those for our, self-confidence or it doesn't, help our self-esteem. It's about, sticking with our purpose of sharing good quality, health information with parents and families.
Exactly. And that story you mentioned earlier about the father coming up and saying about the ADHD episode, like I'm sure that would be far more gratifying that it's reached one person and made an impact as opposed to getting 100, 1,000 listeners or whatever it may be per episode.
Absolutely. I had a patient come in the other day who I've known for a long time and she said, I'm loving the podcast. I learned so much on the teeth episode, as I did with the dentist. And she said, and when my child knocked her tooth out the other day, I knew exactly what to do. And to me, that's the reason we do it. And, today we've released an episode on burns. And the message 100 times over is run your burn under cold water for 20 minutes. I think everyone's going to go away from that episode and take home that one key message. And if that changes one child's life because they've had a burn, which I've had in my lifetime, and we, probably didn't manage it properly when I was a child, I will be happy that it's worthwhile.
Yeah. So true. So true. And like, it's amazing. And when things like that happen, it's just that recall in the brain that all of a sudden they'll remember that podcast from maybe they listened to it 1 or 2 months ago. So,
Yeah.
Lexi, tell me, like having a one-on-one conversation with a parent about the health needs of their child, it's obviously a very intimate and personal conversation. Have you had to adapt your approach so that it reaches a wider audience within your podcast? And what's some of the biggest learnings or adjustments you've had to do or
That's
make?
another great question, Danielle. I think, having practiced for 20 something years, I have a lot of one-on-one conversations about a lot of common child health issues. And I really try, even in my clinical practice, to step back and give an overview, but I always try and give some written information in my clinic because we know that parents actually don't take most of the information in during a busy clinic when your child's running around or, trying to get food. So I think having an accessible format like a podcast or some written information is really helpful. When we do record a podcast, we have to really step back and think about who our audience is. And we actually, went through a process of creating what's called avatars. So we chose a few different people we would think about when we record an episode because we're not trying to talk to other health professionals and doctors. We're trying to get this information to reach parents. So we do have to modify, particularly the language, because, there's so much medical jargon. We have to be very careful legally with the hospital. We're not allowed to use trade names and not allowed to represent or be seen to represent a certain product. So there are limitations and differences than in a one-on-one room. But, we've got a great team who just remind us and can edit out if we make a mistake with the recording.
Yeah, that's good. The good old editors, they come in handy, don't they?
So different than live.
Yeah, I know. Like that's the thing. It's like mentally telling yourself, this is not a live recording. If I say something, I just keep going. Like it's fine. We can always edit it out afterwards.
And I
So,
think that's
like,
why you and I love podcasts because you can have conversations, you can edit things out. And when you're on the radio, you might just be getting to the main point and it's time and it's over. So there's
yeah,
definite advantages of pre-recording.
yeah. Clearly, we're big fans of the old the podcast. But for maybe someone who isn't podcasting yet and would like to create a podcast similar to you, like an education and an awareness based program, what advice would you give what advice would you give to them? Is there maybe like 3 or 4 practical tips to just help set them on the right course?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was instilled in us early from the podcast course we did was know what your purpose is and stick to your purpose. So, really try and find who your audience is, why you're doing it, and really just go for it with passion. But if you're unclear of your purpose and who your audience is, it's going to be much more difficult to keep it going. You're most likely to get burnt out, and it might not be sustainable. So I think number one, purpose. Number two, planning. So we plan quite meticulously our podcast, not in the script. I like scripts that are very conversational, but in terms of time of recording, trying to get our guests comfortable because not every guest is an expert in the studio. And even if they might be a brilliant academic or the best clinician around, once you get them into a studio, they often freeze. So making your guests comfortable, planning in advance, telling them what to expect, but also planning, when you're going to drop episodes, when you're going to market them and how you're going to do that. My other tip is understand the process, do a course, but know your own strengths. And if you have the capacity to get other people to help in certain areas that are not your strength and are incredibly stressful and time consuming, do it. And my last tip is
Absolutely.
if you love it and you're passionate about listening to podcasts, then it's a great idea to go and try it once you've thought about why.
Yeah, there's so much good advice in there. Like, particularly the part around outsourcing what you're not good at. Like, I think some people put these mental roadblocks in their mind there, and it's actually a lot easier than you think. Like, there's um, uh, what are they called?
Sorry, are you hearing my Met call? Sorry.
Yeah, I can.
Oh,
That's it.
we
Right.
can re-record
What
that
I'll
bit
do
if
is
you
I'll
want.
just cut. No, it's okay. I'll just cut your sound out at the background, and then I'll put mine in afterwards.
It's the one
I'll
thing you
just
can't
do that
control is when there's an emergency call.
No, that's cool. And there was one earlier, and I was kind of like, I was like, keep talking, Danielle, because it'll mean that then I can
edit me. But we can redo that bit. Anyway, sorry, back to what we were talking about.
So Lexi, I just think there's so much gold and wisdom in that advice. And I particularly like where you mentioned about like just outsourcing what you're not good at. And I think often people create a lot of mental roadblocks around, but how am I going to do this part to it? And it's actually a lot easier to outsource than many people think. Like there's Upwork and Fiverr and those types of things that people can reach out to. There's uni students who just eat this kind of stuff for breakfast. So, as you said, do what you're good at, which is actually the content and the interviewing part, and making that time for your guests to get comfortable, because it doesn't matter how many podcasts they've done before. I've interviewed some people who I would say are experts in the podcast arena, but turn that camera on and turn that microphone on, and it just takes them a little while to warm up and get into a bit of a flow. So yeah,
absolutely. And I think sorry.
No, you go.
No, I was going to say we've got the luxury of recording in a studio, and during COVID that was hard. We had to, Melbourne, we were in lockdown many, many times, so we had to postpone many episodes of recording. But we decided that for our guests and for us, we really wanted to be in that studio where possible in the hospital, because it just made the conversation flow much more easily.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm very envious. I've got to say, I wish I had a studio to go into. So, Lexi, how can people find out more about the podcast and just continue the conversation and reach out to you?
So our podcast is called KHI, Kids Health Information Podcast. You can find it on the RCH Facebook page or web page, or anywhere you listen to your podcast. You can download and subscribe. So we're in season 4 now. I think we're up to episode 7. Season 4 was released today, but you can go back and listen to any of them at any time. So that's where you can access the podcast. I also am trying to share good quality information in other formats through social media. So my Insta profile, Insta's the one I like to play on, is at Dr. Lexi Fry. And I'm trying to give some written information. So when we have a burns episode coming out, do a Canvatal on first aid for burns, because people learn in different ways. So yeah, you're welcome to follow me there. I also have a LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, but really Insta's my happy place at the moment. And I will be getting a website developed and people can go there.
Wonderful. Lexi, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to tuning into more of your episodes and seeing that 100,000 listeners grow even further. So well done.
Oh, thank you, Danielle. And thank you for all the work you're doing in promoting podcasting and teaching us so much. I wish I would have had your podcast before I started.